What in the world are you doing? Tuppence's voice echoed with a mix of confusion and amusement as she pushed open the door to the inner sanctum of the International Detective Agency. The sight that greeted her was anything but ordinary. There, in the middle of the office, sprawled across the floor in a chaotic sea of books, was none other than her husband, Tommy. His brow furrowed in concentration, but it was clear his well-intentioned efforts had gone terribly wrong. I was attempting to organize these books on the top shelf of that damn cupboard, Tommy grumbled, struggling to right himself, his face red from the exertion, and the blasted chair collapsed under me. Tuppence raised an eyebrow, eyeing the disarray. She bent down to pick up a volume, a bemused expression crossing her face. "And what, pray tell, are these?" she asked, flipping open the book in her hand. "The Hound of the Baskervilles. Oh, how very convenient. I might just read this one again. It's been ages." Tommy, dusting himself off with meticulous care, straightened up and smiled with a hint of excitement in his voice. "You see the idea, don't you?" he asked, clearly eager to explain. "Half hours with the great masters. Imagine it, detective stories by the leading masters of the craft. It's brilliant, really. You know, Tuppence, I've been thinking." He paused dramatically, looking at the mess around him, as though the answer lay hidden amongst the clutter. "We're more or less amateurs at this whole detective business, aren't we? Amateurs in one sense, of course, but I think we could up our game. No harm in picking up a few techniques. These books are where the real skill lies, the way they approach the investigation, the methodical steps, the attention to detail." Tuppence crossed her arms, a smirk playing at the corners of her lips. "Oh, and just how do you plan to become a master, Tommy?" "By imitating their every move." Tommy's face lit up. "Exactly." He gestured around the room, as though revealing some great secret. "I'll try their styles, compare results. You'll see, Tuppence, maybe it's time we stopped being amateurs and became professionals. Who knows? With the right tools, maybe I can give Sherlock Holmes a run for his money." Tuppence couldn't help but laugh. "A professional, huh? You're certainly not about to start wearing a deerstalker, are you?" She reached for another book, but before she could say another word, Tommy interrupted, pointing dramatically to the bottom shelf of the cupboard. No, look closely. What do you see here?" Tuppence glanced down at the odd collection of objects, a futuristic-looking dressing gown, a Turkish slipper, and a violin. Her expression shifted, and a knowing smile crept onto her face. "Obvious, my dear Watson," she said with a twinkle in her eye. Tommy's grin widened. "Exactly. The Sherlock Holmes touch. I've got the camera too, mind you. Footprints. I'll photograph them, enlarge the negatives, make a meticulous record. You'll see. I'm going to crack this mystery wide open." But before he could say more, a loud buzz rang through the office, signaling the arrival of a new client. Our first case," Tommy muttered with a gleam in his eyes. "Albert will take care of the details, but you, my dear, can start typing up our cover story. The more busy and active we seem, the better." Tuppence gave him a sidelong glance, almost as if she was about to object, but then sighed in resignation. "You're impossible," she muttered, heading off toward her desk. "But fine, I'll type. Let's see if your great detective persona really works in real life." As she began typing, Tommy stood for a moment, contemplating their new case, the mystery yet to unfold. Little did they know, this simple client meeting would lead them into a far darker and more twisted affair than they could ever imagine. "On second thoughts, you shall be taking notes in shorthand from my dictation. Let's have a look before we get Albert to send the victim in." They approached the peephole, which had been artistically contrived so as to command a view of the outer office. The client was a girl of about Tuppence's age, tall and dark with a rather haggard face and scornful eyes. "Clothes cheap and striking," remarked Tuppence. "Have her in, Tommy." In another minute the girl was shaking hands with the celebrated Mr. Blunt, whilst Tuppence sat by with eyes demurely downcast, and pad and pencil in hand. "My confidential secretary, Miss Robinson," said Mr. Blunt with a wave of the hand. "You may speak freely before her." Then he lay back for a minute, half closed his eyes, and remarked in a tired tone, "You must find traveling in a bus very crowded at this time of day." "I came in a taxi," said the girl. "Oh," said Tommy, aggrieved. His eyes rested reproachfully on a blue bus ticket protruding from her glove. The girl's eyes followed his glance, and she smiled and drew it out. "You mean this? I picked it up on the pavement. A little neighbor of ours collects them." Tuppence coughed, and Tommy threw a baleful glare at her. "We must get to business," he said briskly. "You are in need of our services, miss." "Kingston Bruce is my name," said the girl. "We live at Wimbledon. Last night a lady who is staying with us lost a valuable pink pearl. Mr. St. Vincent was also dining with us, and during dinner, he happened to mention your firm. My mother sent me off to you this morning, to ask you if you would look into the matter for us." The girl spoke sullenly, almost disagreeably. It was clear as daylight that she and her mother had not agreed over the matter. She was here under protest. "I see," said Tommy, a little puzzled. "You have not called in the police." "No," said Miss Kingston Bruce. "We haven't. It would be idiotic to call in the police, and then find that the silly thing had rolled under the fireplace, or something like that." "Oh," said Tommy, "then the jewel may only be lost after all." Miss Kingston Bruce shrugged her shoulders. "People make such a fuss about things," she murmured. Tommy cleared his throat. "Of course," he said doubtfully. "I am extremely busy just now." "I quite understand," said the girl, rising to her feet. There was a quick gleam of satisfaction in her eyes, which Tuppence for one did not miss. "Nevertheless," continued Tommy, "I think I can manage to run down to Wimbledon. Will you give me the address, please?" "The Laurels, Edgeworth Road." "Make a note of it, please, Miss Robinson." Miss Kingston Bruce hesitated, then said rather ungraciously, "We'll expect you then. Good morning." "Funny girl," said Tommy. "I couldn't quite make her out." "I wonder if she stole the thing herself," remarked Tuppence meditatively. "Come on, Tommy. Let's put away these books and take the car and go down there. By the way, who are you going to be, Sherlock Holmes still?" "I think I need practice for that," said Tommy. "I came rather a cropper over that bus ticket, didn't I?" "You did," said Tuppence. "If I were you I shouldn't try too much on that girl. She's as sharp as a needle. She's unhappy too. Poor devil." "I suppose you know all about her already," said Tommy with sarcasm, "simply from looking at the shape of her nose." "I'll tell you my idea of what we shall find at the Laurels," said Tuppence, quite unmoved. "A household of snobs, very keen to move in the best society. The father, if there is a father, is sure to have a military title. The girl falls in with their way of life, and despises herself for doing so." Tommy took a last look at the books now neatly ranged upon a shelf. "I think," he said, thoughtfully, "that I shall be Thorndyke today." "I shouldn't have thought there was anything medico-legal about this case," remarked Tuppence. "Perhaps not," said Tommy, "but I'm simply dying to use that new camera of mine. It's supposed to have the most marvelous lens that ever was or ever could be." "I know those kind of lenses," said Tuppence. "By the time you've adjusted the shutter and stopped down and calculated the exposure and kept your eyes on the spirit level, your brain gives out, and you yearn for the simple brownie. Only an unambitious soul is content with the simple brownie. Well, I bet I shall get better results with it than you will." Tommy ignored this challenge. "I ought to have a smoker's companion," he said regretfully. "I wonder where one buys them. There's always the patent corkscrew Aunt Araminta gave you last Xmas," said Tuppence helpfully. "That's true," said Tommy. "A curious-looking engine of destruction, I thought it at the time, and rather a humorous present to get from a strictly teetotal aunt." "I," said Tuppence, "shall be Polton." Tommy looked at her scornfully. "Polton indeed. You couldn't begin to do one of the things that he does." "Yes I can," said Tuppence. "I can rub my hands together when I'm pleased. That's quite enough to get on with. I hope you're going to take plaster casts of footprints." Tommy was reduced to silence. Having collected the corkscrew, they went round to the garage, got out the car and started for Wimbledon. The Laurels was a big house. It ran somewhat to gables and turrets, had an air of being very newly painted, and was surrounded with neat flower beds filled with scarlet geraniums. A tall man with a close-cropped white mustache, and an exaggeratedly martial bearing opened the door before Tommy had time to ring. "I've been looking out for you," he explained fussily. "Mr. Blunt, is it not? I am Colonel Kingston Bruce. Will you come into my study?" He led them into a small room at the back of the house. "Young St. Vincent was telling me wonderful things about your firm. I've noticed your advertisements myself. This guaranteed 24 hours service of yours, a marvelous notion. That's exactly what I need." Inwardly anathematizing Tuppence for her irresponsibility in inventing this brilliant detail, Tommy replied, "Just so, Colonel. The whole thing is most distressing, sir." "Most distressing. Perhaps you would kindly give me the facts," said Tommy, with a hint of impatience. "Certainly I will, at once. We have at the present moment staying with us a very old and dear friend of ours, Lady Laura Barton, daughter of the late Earl of Carraway. The present Earl, her brother, made a striking speech in the House of Lords the other day. As I say, she is an old and dear friend of ours. Some American friends of mine who have just come over, the Hamilton Betts, were most anxious to meet her." "Nothing easier," I said. "She is staying with me now. Come down for the weekend. You know what Americans are about titles, Mr. Blunt, and others besides Americans sometimes. Colonel Kingston Bruce. Only too true, my dear sir. Nothing I hate more than a snob. Well, as I was saying, the Betts came down for the weekend. Last night we were playing bridge at the time. The clasp of a pendant Mrs. Hamilton Betts was wearing broke, so she took it off and laid it down on a small table, meaning to take it upstairs with her when she went. This, however, she forgot to do. I must explain, Mr. Blunt, that the pendant consisted of 2 small diamond wings, and a big pink pearl depending from them. The pendant was found this morning lying where Mrs. Betts had left it, but the pearl, a pearl of enormous value, had been wrenched off. Who found the pendant? The parlour maid, Gladys Hill. Any reason to suspect her? She has been with us some years, and we have always found her perfectly honest. But of course one never knows. Exactly. Will you describe your staff, and also tell me who was present at dinner last night? There is the cook. He's been with us only 2 months, but then she would have no occasion to go near the drawing. The same applies to the kitchen maid. Then there is the housemaid, Alice Cummings. She also has been with us for some years, and Lady Laura's maid, of course. She is French. Colonel Kingston Bruce looked very impressive as he said this. Tommy, unaffected by the revelation of the maid's nationality, said, "Exactly." "And the party at dinner? Mr. and Mrs. Betts, ourselves, my wife and daughter, and Lady Laura. Young St. Vincent was dining with us, and Mr. Rennie looked in after dinner for a while." "Who is Mr. Rennie?" "A most pestilential fellow, an arrant socialist. Good-looking, of course, and with a certain specious power of argument. But a man I don't mind telling you, whom I wouldn't trust a yard. A dangerous sort of fella." "In fact," said Tommy dryly, "it is Mr. Rennie whom you suspect." "I do, Mr. Blunt. I'm sure, holding the views he does, that he can have no principles whatsoever. What could have been easier for him than to have quietly wrenched off the pearl at a moment when we were all absorbed in it? There were several absorbing moments, a redoubled no trump hand, I remember, and also a painful argument when my wife had the misfortune to revoke." "Quite so," said Tommy. "I should just like to know one thing. What is Mrs. Betts' attitude in all this?" "She wanted me to call in the police," said Colonel Kingston Bruce reluctantly. "That is when we had searched everywhere in case the pearl had only dropped off. But you dissuaded her." "I was very averse to the idea of publicity, and my wife and daughter backed me up. Then my wife remembered young St. Vincent speaking about your firm at dinner last night, and the 24 hours special service." "Yes," said Tommy with a heavy heart. "You see, in any case no harm will be done. If we call in the police tomorrow, it can be supposed that we thought the jewel merely lost and were hunting for it. By the way, nobody has been allowed to leave the house this morning." "Except your daughter, of course," said Tuppence, speaking for the first time. "Except my daughter," agreed the Colonel. "She volunteered at once to go and put the case before you." Tommy rose. "We will do our best to give you satisfaction, Colonel," he said. "I should like to see the drawing room and the table on which the pendant was laid down. I should also like to ask Mrs. Betts a few questions." After that I will interview the servants, or rather my assistant, Miss Robinson, will do so. He felt his nerve quailing before the terrors of questioning the servants. Colonel Kingston Bruce threw open the door and led them across the hall. As he did so, a remark came to them clearly through the open door of the room they were approaching, and the voice that uttered it was that of the girl who had come to see them that morning. "You know perfectly well, Mother," she was saying, "that she did bring home a teaspoon in her muff." In another minute they were being introduced to Mrs. Kingston Bruce, a plaintive lady with a languid manner. Miss Kingston Bruce acknowledged their presence with a short inclination of the head. Her face was more sullen than ever. Mrs. Kingston Bruce was voluble. "But I know who I think took it," she ended. "That dreadful socialist young man. He loves the Russians and the Germans and hates the English. What else can you expect?" "He never touched it," said Miss Kingston Bruce fiercely. "I was watching him, all the time. I couldn't have failed to see if he had." She looked at them defiantly with her chin up. Tommy created a diversion by asking for an interview with Mrs. Betts. When Mrs. Kingston Bruce had departed accompanied by her husband and daughter to find Mrs. Betts, he whistled thoughtfully. "I wonder," he said gently, "who it was who had a teaspoon in her muff." "Just what I was thinking," replied Tuppence. Mrs. Betts, followed by her husband, burst into the room. She was a big woman with a determined voice. Mr. Hamilton Betts looked dyspeptic and subdued. "I understand, Mr. Blunt, that you are a private inquiry agent, and one who hustles things through at a great rate." "Hustle," said Tommy, "is my middle name, Mrs. Betts. Let me ask you a few questions." Thereafter things proceeded rapidly. Tommy was shown the damaged pendant, the table on which it had lain, and Mr. Betts emerged from his taciturnity to mention the value, in dollars, of the stolen pearl, and withal Tommy felt an irritating certainty that he was not getting on. "I think that will do," he said at length. "Miss Robinson, will you kindly fetch the special photographic apparatus from the hall?" Miss Robinson complied. "A little invention of my own," said Tommy. "In appearance, you see, it is just like an ordinary camera." He had some slight satisfaction in seeing that the Betts were impressed. He photographed the pendant, the table on which it had lain, and took several general views of the apartment. Then Miss Robinson was delegated to interview the servants, and in view of the eager expectancy on the faces of Colonel Kingston Bruce and Mrs. Betts, Tommy felt called upon to say a few authoritative words. "The position amounts to this," he said. "Either the pearl is still in the house, or it is not still in the house." "Quite so," said the Colonel with more respect than was perhaps quite justified by the nature of the remark. "If it is not in the house, it may be anywhere, but if it is in the house, it must necessarily be concealed somewhere, and a search must be made," broke in Colonel Kingston Bruce. "Quite so. I give you carte blanche, Mr. Blunt. Search the house from attic to cellar." "Oh, Charles," murmured Mrs. Kingston Bruce tearfully, "do you think that is wise? The servants won't like it. I'm sure they'll leave." "We will search their quarters last," said Tommy soothingly. "The thief is sure to have hidden the gem in the most unlikely place." "I seem to have read something of the kind," agreed the Colonel. "Quite so," said Tommy. "You probably remember the case of Rex v. Bailey, which created a precedent." Oh, yes," said the Colonel, looking puzzled. "Now the most unlikely place is in the apartments of Mrs. Betts," continued Tommy. "My, wouldn't that be too cute?" said Mrs. Betts admiringly. Without more ado, she took him up to her room, where Tommy once more made use of the special photographic apparatus. Presently Tuppence joined him there. "You have no objection, I hope, Mrs. Betts, to my assistance looking through your wardrobe?" "Why not at all? Do you need me here any longer?" Tommy assured her that there was no need to detain her, and Mrs. Betts departed. "We might as well go on bluffing it out," said Tommy. "But personally I don't believe we've a dog's chance of finding the thing." "Curse you and your 24 hours stunt, Tuppence." "Listen," said Tuppence. "The servants are all right, I'm sure, but I managed to get something out of the French maid. It seems that when Lady Laura was staying here a year ago, she went out to tea with some friends of the Kingston Bruces, and when she got home a teaspoon fell out of her muff. Everyone thought it must have fallen in by accident. But talking about similar robberies, I got hold of a lot more. Lady Laura is always staying about with people. She hasn't got a bean, I gather, and she's out for comfortable quarters with people to whom a title still means something. It may be a coincidence, or it may be something more, but 5 distinct thefts have taken place whilst she has been staying in various houses, sometimes trivial things, sometimes valuable jewels. "Whoo," said Tommy, and gave vent to a prolonged whistle. "Where's the old bird's room, do you know?" "Just across the passage." "Then I rather think that we'll just slip across and investigate." The room opposite stood with its door ajar. It was a spacious apartment, with white enameled fittings and rose-pink curtains. An inner door led to a bathroom. At the door of this appeared a slim dark girl, very neatly dressed. Tuppence checked the exclamation of astonishment on the girl's lips. "This is Elise, Mr. Blunt," she said prettily. "Lady Laura's maid." Tommy stepped across the threshold of the bathroom, and approved inwardly its sumptuous and up-to-date fittings. He set to work to dispel the wide stare of suspicion on the French girl's face. "You are busy with your duties, eh, Mademoiselle Elise?" "Yes, monsieur. I clean the lady's bath." "Well, perhaps you'll help me with some photography instead. I have a special kind of camera here, and I am photographing the interiors of all the rooms in this house." He was interrupted by the communicating door to the bedroom, banging suddenly behind him. Elise jumped at the sound. "What did that?" "It must have been the wind," said Tuppence. "We will come into the other room," said Tommy. Elise went to open the door for them, but the doorknob rattled aimlessly. "What's the matter?" said Tommy sharply. "Ah, monsieur, but somebody must have locked it on the other side." She caught up a towel and tried again, but this time the door handle turned easily enough, and the door swung open. "Voilà, c'est qui est curieux." "It must have stuck," said Elise. There was no one in the bedroom. Tommy fetched his apparatus. Tuppence and Elise worked under his orders, but again and again his glance went back to the communicating door. "I wonder," he said between his teeth. "I wonder why that door stuck." He examined it minutely, shutting and opening it. It fitted perfectly. "One picture more," he said with a sigh. "Will you loop back that rose curtain, Mademoiselle Elise?" "Thank you, just hold it so." The familiar click occurred. He handed a glass slide to Elise to hold, relinquished the tripod to Tuppence, and carefully readjusted and closed the camera. He made some easy excuse to get rid of Elise, and as soon as she was out of the room he caught hold of Tuppence and spoke rapidly. "Look here. I've got an idea. Can you hang on here, search all the rooms, that will take some time. Try and get an interview with the old bird Lady Laura, but don't alarm her. Tell her you suspect the parlour maid. But whatever you do, don't let her leave the house. I'm going off in the car. I'll be back as soon as I can." "All right," said Tuppence, "but don't be too cocksure. You've forgotten one thing."
"What's that?"
"The girl. There's something funny about that girl. Listen, I found out the time she started from the house this morning. It took her 2 hours to get to our office." "That's nonsense. Where did she go before she came to us?" "There's something in that," admitted her husband. "We'll follow up any old clue you like. But don't let Lady Laura leave the house." "What's that?" His quick ear had caught a faint rustle outside on the landing. He strode across to the door, but there was no one to be seen. "Well, so long," he said. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Tuppence watched him drive off in the car with a faint misgiving. Tommy was very sure. She herself was not so sure. There were 1 or 2 things she did not quite understand. She was still standing by the window, watching the road, when she saw a man leave the shelter of a gateway opposite, cross the road and ring the bell. In a flash, Tuppence was out of the room and down the stairs. Gladys Hill, the parlour maid, was emerging from the back part of the house, but Tuppence motioned her back authoritatively. Then she went to the front door and opened it. A lanky young man with ill-fitting clothes and eager dark eyes was standing on the step. He hesitated a moment, and then said, "Is Miss Kingston Bruce in?" "Will you come inside?" said Tuppence. She stood aside to let him enter, closing the door. "Mr. Rennie, I think," she said sweetly. He shot a quick glance at her.
Oh yes.
"Will you come in here, please?" She opened the study door. The room was empty, and Tuppence entered it after him, closing the door behind her. He turned on her with a frown. "I want to see Miss Kingston Bruce." "I am not quite sure that you can," said Tuppence composedly. "Look here, who the devil are you?" said Mr. Rennie rudely. "International Detective Agency," said Tuppence succinctly, and noticed Mr. Rennie's uncontrollable start. "Please sit down, Mr. Rennie," she went on. "To begin with, we know all about Miss Kingston Bruce's visit to you this morning. It was a bold guess, but it succeeded." Perceiving his consternation, Tuppence went on quickly. "The recovery of the pearl is the great thing, Mr. Rennie. No one in this house is anxious for publicity. Can't we come to some arrangement?" The young man looked at her keenly. "I wonder how much you know," he said thoughtfully. "Let me think for a moment." He buried his head in his hands, then asked a most unexpected question. "I say, is it really true that young Saint Vincent is engaged to be married?" "Quite true," said Tuppence. "I know the girl." Mr. Rennie suddenly became confidential. "It's been hell," he confided. "They've been asking him here morning, noon and night, chucking Beatrice at his head, all because he'll come into a title someday. If I had my way—" "Don't let's talk politics," said Tuppence hastily. "Do you mind telling me, Mr. Rennie, why you think Miss Kingston Bruce took the pearl?" "You do," said Tuppence calmly. "You wait to see the detective, as you think, drive off and the coast clear, and then you come and ask for her. It's obvious. If you'd taken the pearl yourself,
You wouldn't be half so upset."
Her manner was so odd," said the young man. "She came this morning, and told me about the robbery, explaining that she was on her way to a firm
Of private detectives.
She seemed anxious to say something, and yet not able to get it out. "Well," said Tuppence, "all I want is the pearl. You'd better go and talk to her." But at that moment, Colonel Kingston Bruce opened the door. "Lunch is ready, Miss Robinson. You will lunch with us, I hope." Then he stopped and glared at the guest. "Clearly," said Mr. Rennie, "you don't want to ask me to lunch. All right, I'll go." "Come back later," whispered Tuppence, as he passed her. Tuppence followed Colonel Kingston Bruce, still growling into his mustache about the pestilential impudence of some people, into a massive dining room, where the family was already assembled. Only one person present was unknown to Tuppence. "This Lady Laura is Miss Robinson, who is kindly assisting us." Lady Laura bent her head, and then proceeded to stare at Tuppence through her pince-nez. She was a tall, thin woman, with a sad smile, a gentle voice, and very hard, shrewd eyes. Tuppence returned her stare, and Lady Laura's eyes dropped. After lunch, Lady Laura entered into conversation with an air of gentle curiosity. How was the inquiry proceeding? Tuppence laid suitable stress on the suspicion attaching to the parlour-maid, but her mind was not really on Lady Laura. Lady Laura might conceal teaspoons and other articles in her clothing, but Tuppence felt fairly sure that she had not taken the pink pearl. Presently Tuppence proceeded with her search of the house. Time was going on. There was no sign of Tommy and, what mattered far more to Tuppence, there was no sign of Mr. Rennie. Suddenly Tuppence came out of a bedroom and collided with Beatrice Kingston Bruce, who was going downstairs. She was fully dressed for the street. "I'm afraid," said Tuppence, "that you mustn't go out just now." The other girl looked at her haughtily. "Whether I go out or not is no business of yours," she said coldly. "It is my business whether I communicate with the police or not, though," said Tuppence. In a minute the girl had turned ashy pale. You mustn't, I won't go out, but don't do that." She clung to Tuppence beseechingly. "My dear Miss Kingston Bruce," said Tuppence smiling, "the case has been perfectly clear to me from the start." But she was interrupted. In the stress of her encounter with the girl, Tuppence had not heard the front door bell. Now, to her astonishment, Tommy came bounding up the stairs, and in the hall below she caught sight of a big burly man in the act of removing a bowler hat. "Detective Inspector Marriott of Scotland Yard," he said with a grin. With a cry, Beatrice Kingston Bruce tore herself from Tuppence's grasp and dashed down the stairs, just as the front door was opened once more to admit Mr. Rennie. "Now you have torn it," said Tuppence bitterly.
"Hey,"
said Tommy, hurrying into Lady Laura's room. He passed on into the bathroom, and picked up a large cake of soap which he brought out in his hands. The inspector was just mounting the stairs. "She went quite quietly," he announced. "She's an old hand, and knows when the game is up." "What about the pearl?" "I rather fancy," said Tommy, handing him the soap, "that you'll find it in here." The inspector's eyes lit up appreciatively. "An old trick, and a good one. Cut a cake of soap in half, scoop out a place for the jewel, clap it together again, and smooth the join wed over with hot water. A very smart piece of work on your part, sir." Tommy accepted the compliment gracefully. He and Tuppence descended the stairs. Colonel Kingston Bruce rushed. Tommy's eyes gleamed as he extended his hand toward the man, shaking it with warmth and a touch of theatricality. "My dear sir," he began with a broad smile, his voice filled with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough. Lady Laura wishes to extend her gratitude as well." But before the man could respond, Tommy's demeanor shifted ever so slightly. However, he continued with a knowing look, "I'm afraid I can't stay any longer. I have a rather urgent appointment to attend to. A member of the cabinet, you see." Without waiting for a reply, Tommy hurried toward the door, slipping out into the cold evening air. He jumped into the waiting car with a practiced ease, and in the next instant, Tuppence was beside him, following suit. "Tommy, wait," she cried, her voice tinged with confusion. But haven't they arrested Lady Laura after all?" Tommy barely glanced at her as the car roared to life, the tires screeching against the pavement. "Oh," he replied, his tone casual, but there was a spark in his eyes. "Didn't I tell you? They haven't arrested Lady Laura. They've arrested Elise." Tuppence's face froze.
"What?"
Elise. The name echoed in her mind like a strange riddle that hadn't quite clicked into place. Tommy leaned back in the seat, his eyes distant as he spoke, clearly enjoying the moment. "You see," he began, his voice taking on a quieter, more contemplative tone, "I've tried opening a door with soap on my hands. It's nearly impossible. Your hands slip all over the place, no matter how hard you try." Tuppence turned to him, curiosity now piqued, and she pressed. Tommy's lips twitched into a grin. "Well, I started wondering, what could Elise have been doing with soap to get her hands so slippery? She must have had something to do with it, right?" He paused for a moment, savoring the dramatic build-up. "She grabbed a towel to wipe the handle, didn't she? But the trick was that she left no trace of soap behind. It was all too neat, far too neat for an amateur." Tuppence's brow furrowed as she tried to piece the puzzle together. "So," Tommy continued, his voice now low, almost conspiratorial, "well, if you were a professional thief, and you were working as a maid to a lady suspected of kleptomania, what better cover would you have? You'd be the perfect person to blend in, the perfect accomplice, hiding in plain sight." Tuppence gasped, "But how did you know?" "I thought Elise was just another face in the crowd." Tommy winked. "Ah, that's the trick, Tuppence. I had my suspicions, of course. So I set up a little plan." He leaned in, his eyes gleaming with excitement as he spoke. "I managed to snap a photo of her, and a photo of the room, mind you, all without raising suspicion. Then I convinced her to handle a glass slide, a little test, if you will. I took that slide straight to dear old Scotland Yard." Tuppence's eyes widened as the pieces started to click into place. "Scotland Yard," she whispered. "Indeed," Tommy replied, his grin widening. "I had the film developed lightning fast. The negative came out perfect, clean and clear. We got a successful identification of her fingerprints. But that's not all. The photo, well, that confirmed everything. Elise was no ordinary maid. She was a long-lost acquaintance, a professional, you might say." Tuppence sat back in shock, her mind racing. "And to think," she muttered, half in disbelief, "that those two young idiots were wasting their time, suspecting each other, fumbling about in their amateurish ways, Like in the books. Tommy's eyes twinkled as he looked at her. Exactly, he replied. But here's the thing, Tuppence. I didn't tell you what I was up to for a reason. Tuppence raised an eyebrow, intrigued. And what reason was that? Tommy's smile grew just a little wider. Well, for one thing, I suspected Elise might have been eavesdropping on the landing. It wouldn't be the first time someone has tried to get a peek at the detective's secrets. Tuppence nodded slowly, still processing. And the second reason, she asked, her curiosity now piqued more than ever. Tommy's voice dropped an octave, almost smugly. Ah, Tuppence, he said with a knowing look, you forget. Thorndyke never tells until the last moment. Besides, my dear, you and your friend Janet Smith pulled one over on me last time, didn't you? This time though, his eyes gleamed. This time we're square.